Hello everybody and welcome to Did Battle Royale Ever Occur in History? Now, in the recent years, as you well know, Battle Royale has basically become a subject of popularity. As you can see by the recent games of basically Fortnite and PUBG and all the rest of them, Battle Royale as a whole is genuinely getting popular as of now. But has Battle Royale ever occurred or been popular in the past? In today's video, I'm just basically going to find out whether or not Battle Royale has ever happened in human history and give some details on the actual subject itself. Alright then guys, what instance in history can we use that relates to the subject of Battle Royale? Now, the subject of history which I have chosen is Roman history in the gladiatorial times, as these times are the most accurate times I could find which represent what we're trying to find out. First off, we're going to talk about when did the gladiatorial games first start? Now, we don't really know. I can give you a sort of a time roughly, but there is no actual time I can basically give you, as obviously it was done a very long time ago, and we can only go by what we've basically found. So apparently the gladiatorial games first came about near the end of the Punic War of the 3rd century BC. So basically, the Punic War was a series of wars fought between Romans and Carthage from 264 BC to 146 BC at the time. So that is when they first started. So ultimately, what were these games created for? What were the gladiatorial games created for? And the main purpose of these gladiatorial games was just to entertain the crowd. That's pretty much the main purpose of it. But sometimes in these gladiatorial games, they would take in criminals for execution. So they would obviously have a gladiator, and he would fight the villain in one-to-one combat, or they'd have probably 3-on-1 and they'd probably publicly beat him or kill him. These games were quite brutal. Mostly these games would consist of a few things. They would consist of Gladiator v Gladiator, Gladiator v Wild Animals, and obviously, as I said beforehand, the gladiators versus condemned criminals. So that was the sort of main attraction of these games. Firstly, the games that first started were actually the animals. So the games that came about first were gladiators fighting animals. But as the popularity of the game increased, they started to fight other gladiators as well as those. I mean, the often gladiator was a slave. So basically, slaves would be either people who had gone against the Roman Empire, or anybody who they could just basically could get their hands on, were sold off at auction and basically sold off to luduses. A ludus would take in these obviously gladiators, and they would train them in the art of combat in very harsh conditions until they eventually pitched off into the arena to fight off other gladiators to obviously appease the crowd and earn some coin for the Dominus. The Dominus was the leader of the ludus, and he was a Lanista basically, and the Lanistas would basically have each of these little schools that were around, and these schools were one of the ones responsible for training up these gladiators in the first place. Now, not all of these gladiators were actually slaves. Some of them were people who volunteered and would risk their life. Many of gladiatorial games took place during these times, and it was quite the times to be around. Even some of the gladiators were basically well known as sort of a celebrity sort of status among the people who used to watch them kill everyone, which is not the most pleasant thing ever, but there you go. But after a while of fighting as a gladiator over a certain amount of time, they may have the option to get a thing called a rudus. Now, what a rudus is most gladiators, as I was talking about beforehand, are slaves, right? Now, a rudus is a little wooden sword that has all of their victories carved into it as stories to basically prove their freedom, and they can carry this little sword around to show that they were once a gladiator and were freed because of how well they performed in these games. So that is what a rudus was. So back then it was possible to earn your freedom as a gladiator, but a lot of the time through the harsh conditions and obviously fighting to the death most of the time, obviously a lot of them didn't make it, but the ones who did were basically free. These gladiatorial gladiatorial games ended when they ended in the early 5th century after the adoption of Christianity of the Roman Empire in 380. Although the typical beast hunting, which first started it all off, was continued in the 6th century. So a typical common gladiator would normally be wielding obviously a helmet, a sort of an arm, a shoulder pad, basically that would consist of like a strap that goes around them to the side and then off, and then they would have shoes and a sword and a shield. The sword is a very well-known sword. It's called a gladius. That's what it looks like on screen. It's quite a short sword, and it's mostly a one-handed grip, but it's very famous among that. They did also used to have other fighting styles, as some of them would wield like a trident or like a spear and a net, and some of them would go to dual-wielded swords, so they would have two gladiuses in either hand, which they would basically fight with. Of course, back then, times were very religious, and gladiators were basically trained to basically even to accept death. And back then, you know, it was a glorious death to die amongst another gladiator in single combat. I mean, oftentimes most of these people would believe there was even an afterlife in the first place for them to go to after they had been brutally murdered within the stadium. Anyway, that pretty much concludes this video. There's not much else that I know of that actually any times in history that actually had essence of Battle Royale in it. Now, commonly Battle Royale consists of 100 people versus 100 people now in modern time in games, but back in the gladiatorial times, I would probably think that the most they would probably get to is probably 20 men in the arena each side, so 10 for each, and they would probably have a massive battle there as teams. But I doubt it was anything like basically like a free-for-all or 100 300. Do you know what's interesting to me about this whole lot though? It's interesting to me that basically the essence of Battle Royale has existed for a long time ago, and the fact that we still watch it and do it today, not to the same extent of course, but the fact that we still do is interesting in its own sentiment, because it just kind of still means that we have the same sort of psychology as we did back then. Obviously our rules and our conditions of how we do it has changed beyond obviously, but the base of it, the base of what it is, has not, which is just to me is interesting. But anyway guys, that is the main instance of Battle Royale in history. If you enjoy this video, then please obviously leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thank you very much for watching, and bye.